As I noted earlier, Claire begins the entry with an account of his health. Very ill today and very unhappy. My 3 children are all unwell, had a dismal dream of being in hell. There's a little rhyme there, actually. Yet, that entry concludes with a rather different account of life and death, nature and survival, one that is allegorical and seems an antidote to Claire's commemoration as born, not made. Claire writes, this is in the journal at October 6th, "Neglect is the rust of life, that eateth it away, and layeth the best of minds fallow, and maketh them desert." Done nothing. Well, Frederick Martin, in the passage that I mentioned above, calls Claire a being to whom all life was golden, and all nature a breath of paradise, and the journal entry that concludes with Claire describing his imagined grave, life, far from golden, is a base metal, subject to corrosion, not through exposure to the elements per se, but neglect by the public. Abandonment, disinterest, forgetting of the sort that Claire describes in I Am, where he writes, "I am, yet what I am none cares or knows. My friends forsake me like a memory lost." An experience, and not to mention directly experienced by life in asylum, becomes an active form of wasting away, despite its passive mode, forgetting. So corrosion becomes something that's both active and passive. It's active because it's corrosive, it's wasting something away, but what is corroding is forgetting or neglect, something that's actually passive rather than a kind of active gesture. So if forgetting is figured as an act of destruction, can remembrance also be a form of neglect? Can valorization, the attention that in some respect Claire longed for when he figured himself as a boxer or Byron, can this be a version of disregard? And if that's the case, and if this is what one reading of Claire's actual grave reveals, and its difference from his early wishes, this is not the end of the story. For the transformation of poetic life into biological life, claimed by the grave, and the history of poetry in which it participates, is threatened by the possibility that it might be a form of neglect, that it might corrode the very life that it posits. And this is what we discover when we read Claire's physical grave according to his account of destruction. Fame and memorialization, which nevertheless conjoin biological and poetic life, are an antithetical mode of neglect. They're not what you expect neglect to be, right? The bigger, the more monumental. They're an antithetical mode of neglect, and so a slow death that eats away at life, and that leaves the mind fallow. So one way of describing this grave might be to borrow Claire's words, the words with which he concludes this entry, and also the previous one, done nothing. In the stripped-down language of inoperativity that we might expect of Beckett rather than, say, Keats, we find a description not only of Claire's ongoing life, but also of his grave, both the imagined and the real. And at this moment, the quotidian and the monumental, the division and the conflation of life and poetry seem, at the end, to arrive at the same place. And how could they not? Claire aspired to a future that depended upon the negation and affirmation of his biological life in the service of poetic survival. And his public construed poetry as a biological inheritance, albeit one that reflects not continuity with nature, but its transcendence. So let me conclude with one final piece of evidence and one last grave. So although Claire's plans for his grave are seemingly prompted by a rather serious bout with the flu, this kind of long illness, the dreams, the nights in hell, which makes it seem like they're just kind of minor, episodic, the sketch of the grave harkens back to an earlier moment at the journal's very inception. So from the very beginning, Claire frames his journal and his life and his survival in relation to the grave, when he sketches a first gravestone opposite the title page of the journal. I didn't bring a slide of it. This stone bears not his name, but the naked names of 3 other poets, Chatterton, Bloomfield, and Keats. Jonathan Bate understands this gesture as an act through which Claire places himself firmly in the prematurely dead lower-class poet society. And indeed, Bloomfield had recently died, and Claire was deeply upset by this. But I would suggest that this mass grave of natural genius and poetic prosperity is more complex than Bates' description implies. These are dead poets who live on through their poetry. Their grave is undated, their survival contingent on the effacement of the very biological life that heightened their fame. But Clare doesn't simply list his name alongside theirs, just as he didn't simply leave his grave undated. Rather, Clare writes his life, not just his name, alongside their deaths. The 6th of September, the day upon which the journal begins, is one that Clare calls a beginning, and which we can understand as the beginning of a quotidian textualization of life that introduces the possibility and promise of life beyond life for posterity, not in the prestige of poetry, but in the everydayness of the journal. At the same time, this life beyond life bears as its condition, and despite Clare's wishes, biological life, the life of the peasant body whose ailments and sufferings cannot and will not be arrested by the image of a grave, and whose posthumous existence continues to be guaranteed, not simply by the existence of so many pages of poetry, but by the recollection of the peasant body in its suffering, in its corrosion, and in its discontent. It is this paradox, this unresolved experience of the relation of life to poetry that describes not only the operations of a biopolitical epoch, but the unaccounted work of romantic biopoetics. Thanks.
Thank you very much. So we still have about, sorry, did we already have a question about that? I don't know if you can find out. You have a microphone if you think it's necessary, but let's give it a try. Oh, see.
Thank you so much for your talk. I'm thinking a lot about Susan Howe and her marginalia of Emily Dickinson. And I would like to go back to the previous, and I'm thinking about Susan Howe and how she instructs looking at marginalia. And I see he spells here and he spells Hopes and he spells his name with caps. So if you just read the caps, you read here, Hopes, John Clare. I don't know if you looked at, thought about that. And it's interesting because Hope seemed to be in the 19th century, especially the early 19th century, a preoccupation. I don't know if you looked at Thomas Campbell's Pleasures of Hope that he wrote in 1803, as well as there is a letter that Byron wrote to Thomas More in 1815 that talks about this preoccupation and this tension with existential meandering concerning hope. So I don't know if you've...
I haven't, but that's helpful.
Yeah, so I thought that was interesting.
Okay, thanks. You're right. I've noticed the Here Hopes John Clare, and it's a way of thinking about the posthumous, right? I mean, to reanimate. It turns it into a more conventional epitaph in a way, right? Many of the epitaphs of this moment reanimate the dead, attribute to them a kind of life or voice or an ability to respond, despite the very inability that death would seem to assume. So read in this way, you see that there's a kind of indissociability between the two versions. I think that might be part of what you're pointing out. So thanks.
Did you?
So my question is about theoretical understanding of biopolitics you mentioned about, because I think that in biopolitics nowadays is more like the terms about collectively, like you mentioned about multiple, that almost all the biopolitics theorists talking about biopolitics of emphasizing some kind of collectively or kind of multiple, but I think that, and also Michel Foucault, I guess his idea of biopolitics is very ambivalent, because his idea about biopolitics is almost like negative in some sense, because it is like apparatus that controlling human life, and life itself becomes a kind of register to controlling the human beings, and but your understanding of biopolitics is a little bit like very positive, I guess. And so I guess, and romanticism, or romantic poet, comes from the idea of individual individual with natural genius. So how can you make some connection between nowadays contemporary understanding of biopolitics as kind of collectively, because Agamben just pointing out some coming community as idea of biopolitics, and Badiou also talking about multiple, and also Negri also talking about multitude. So all those kind of ideas of biopolitics nowadays is very kind of collectively idea. So how can you make connection between?
Which